April 18, 1942, 8:20 a.m., 650 nautical miles east of Tokyo. The deck of USS Hornet pitched and rolled in the gray Pacific swell, seawater spraying across the flight deck where 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers sat lashed down, their twin tails rising above the carrier's superstructure like metal birds too large for their nest. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle stood on the rain-slicked deck, watching waves crash over the bow, calculating distances that should not have mattered because this mission should not have been possible. A B-25 medium bomber weighed 14 tons fully loaded. It had never taken off from a carrier deck. Carriers were built for fighters and dive bombers, light aircraft with folding wings and tail hooks. The Mitchell had neither. Its wingspan was 67 feet. The Hornet's deck was barely wider. The takeoff run required for a land-based bomber was 3,000 feet. Doolittle had 467 feet of rolling deck before he would either achieve flight or plunge into the Pacific. The entire plan violated every principle of naval aviation, defied engineering constraints, and existed solely because 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America needed to prove something to the world and to itself, that no target was beyond reach, that no enemy capital was safe, that American power recognized no boundaries. As Doolittle climbed into his cockpit and throttled the Wright Cyclone engines to full power, he was not just attempting an unprecedented carrier launch. He was announcing that the rules of warfare had changed. That distance itself was no longer a defense, and that the nation which controlled the sky could strike anywhere, anytime. Regardless of geography or conventional limitations, for 2,000 years, warfare had been constrained by proximity. Armies marched to battle. Navies sailed to engage. Even with the advent of aircraft, range remained the ultimate limitation. Bombers could strike only as far as fuel and payload calculations permitted, and then only if they could return to friendly bases. Geography offered protection. The British Channel had shielded England for centuries. The vast Pacific Ocean separated Japan from American power projection. Hitler had conquered continental Europe because terrain and distance favored concentrated ground forces. The Axis powers had built their strategies around the assumption that modern warfare still obeyed ancient rules, that heartlands were safe, that production centers could operate beyond enemy reach, that civilian populations would never experience war's realities directly unless armies first conquered intervening territory. The Doolittle Raid shattered those assumptions in a single morning, not through overwhelming force, but through audacious reach. 16 bombers carrying 1 ton of ordnance each would accomplish militarily negligible damage to Tokyo's industrial capacity. But they would prove categorically that American bombers could appear in Japanese skies without warning, launched from mobile platforms that could approach and withdraw before interceptors scrambled. The psychological impact would far exceed the physical destruction, because the raid answered a question that terrified Axis leadership. If America could strike Tokyo 4 months after Pearl Harbor with improvised tactics and jury-rigged equipment, what would American power accomplish when fully mobilized? The mission's genesis lay in desperation and innovation in equal measure. After Pearl Harbor, American morale had collapsed into a mixture of rage and helplessness. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. The Philippines were falling. Wake Island had surrendered. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia with impunity, while the U.S. Navy licked its wounds and attempted to rebuild carrier strength that would take years to achieve. President Roosevelt demanded action, some demonstration that America could strike back, that the war would not be entirely defensive for the foreseeable future. Navy Captain Francis Lowe proposed the impossible, launching Army bombers from Navy carriers. The idea was tactically insane. Carriers were not designed to accommodate medium bombers. The B-25 could not land on a carrier deck, meaning any crew that launched would have to fly onward to friendly territory, over 1,200 miles of Japanese-controlled airspace, or ditch in the ocean. The risks were catastrophic. The logistics were nightmarish. But the psychological value was incalculable. And so, the Navy and Army Air Forces, institutions that typically regarded each other with suspicion and bureaucratic territoriality, collaborated on a mission that required each to trust the other completely. Doolittle's crews trained at Eglin Field in Florida, practicing short takeoffs until they could lift a fully loaded B-25 in distances that aeronautical engineers had declared impossible. They stripped the bombers of unnecessary equipment, installed additional fuel tanks, and accepted that this was a one-way mission. Launch, bomb Tokyo, fly to China, crash land or bail out, and hope that nationalist Chinese forces would find them before the Japanese did. The symbolism of the stripped-down bombers was profound. These aircraft carried no defensive armor, minimal armament, and extra fuel in place of standard equipment. They were built for range, not for combat or survival. Every ounce of weight had been calculated against the distance to China. Every gallon of fuel measured against the miles between Tokyo and freedom. The B-25, an ungainly twin-engine design meant for ground support and tactical bombing, had been transformed into a strategic weapon through sheer willpower and mathematical precision. It represented American pragmatism taken to its logical extreme. If the mission required something impossible, make it possible through engineering, training, and acceptance of extraordinary risk. The 16 bombers launched from Hornet's deck on April 18th, in seas rough enough that the carrier's bow dipped below swells, flooding the forward deck with seawater. Doolittle went first, his engines screaming at full throttle as the Mitchell lumbered down the deck, struggling for speed, the propellers clawing at air while the tail lifted and the aircraft balanced on the knife edge between flight and disaster. At the last possible moment, the nose lifted, the wheels cleared the deck, and Doolittle banked away to allow the next bomber to launch. One by one, all 16 made it airborne, defying physics and probability, disappearing into the clouds that would hide them for the 650-mile approach to the Japanese coast. Not one crashed on takeoff. Not one faltered. Watching from the Hornet's bridge, Admiral William Halsey understood that he had just witnessed something unprecedented: the projection of land-based air power from a seaborne platform, extending American reach beyond any previous calculation. The B-25 had become a symbol of limitless range, an aircraft that could strike anywhere because it was willing to die anywhere. Because the crews understood that demonstrating American reach mattered more than their individual survival. The bombers arrived over Tokyo shortly after noon, flying at rooftop level to avoid radar detection, climbing only to release their ordnance over industrial targets, military facilities, and dockyards. Japanese civilians, who had been assured by their government that the home islands were invulnerable to air attack, looked up in disbelief at American bombers, unmistakable twin-engine aircraft with U.S. Army Air Forces markings, droning overhead in broad daylight, unopposed and unhurried. Air raid sirens, silent since the start of the war, wailed across the capital. Anti-aircraft batteries, caught completely unprepared, fired sporadically and ineffectively. Fighter aircraft scrambled too late, chasing bombers that had already released their payloads and were racing toward the coast at wave-top altitude. The physical damage was modest. For the German leadership watching from Europe, the Doolittle Raid was a revelation wrapped in a warning. Hitler had dismissed American military capability as the product of a mongrel democracy incapable of sustaining the discipline necessary for modern warfare. The raid demonstrated otherwise. It showed that American forces could coordinate inter-service operations requiring the Navy to risk its most valuable carriers and the Army to risk its air crews on a mission with minimal chance of survival. It showed that American industry could modify standard aircraft for specialized missions on compressed timelines. Most importantly, it showed that American strategic thinking prioritized psychological impact and long-term advantage over conventional measures of success. The Germans had built their doctrine around decisive battle, territorial conquest, and the destruction of enemy armies. The Americans had just demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice aircraft and risk crews for a mission that achieved no traditional military objectives, but reshaped the entire strategic calculus of the Pacific War. The B-25 became a symbol not just of American reach but of American flexibility, the ability to repurpose, adapt, and improvise solutions to problems that conventional military thinking declared insoluble. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, had assured Hitler that American air power posed no serious threat, that American bombers were inferior to German designs, and that the Atlantic Ocean provided absolute protection for German-occupied Europe. The Doolittle Raid forced a reassessment. If American carriers could launch medium bombers against Tokyo, what prevented similar operations against European targets? If American aircrew were willing to undertake one-way missions for strategic effect, what did that say about American resolve and willingness to absorb casualties? German intelligence agencies scrambled to understand how the raid had been accomplished, seeking technical details that would allow them to predict and counter future operations. What they discovered was more unsettling than the raid itself. The Americans had accomplished the impossible through collaboration, training, and acceptance of risk, the same formula they were applying to every aspect of the war effort. The B-25, a standard twin-engine bomber, had been transformed into a strategic weapon because American doctrine did not limit weapons to their designed purposes. If a mission required aircraft to do something they were not built for, the American approach was to train crews and modify aircraft until the impossible became routine. Lieutenant Jacob de Chazer, bombardier on crew number 16, survived 4 years as a Japanese prisoner of war. In captivity, he experienced torture, starvation, and prolonged isolation. He also experienced a transformation that captured the broader meaning of the Doolittle Raid. Given access to a Bible by his captors, de Chazer converted to Christianity and, after the war, returned to Japan as a missionary, dedicating his life to reconciliation. His story became emblematic of the raid's deeper significance, that American power was not merely destructive, but transformative, that the same nation which could strike Tokyo from a carrier deck could also extend forgiveness and rebuild shattered societies. The B-25 that carried de Chazer to Tokyo had been a weapon of war. The man who returned to Japan was a messenger of peace. Both missions required the same fundamental capability: the ability to project American presence across any distance, to boundaries that were not geographic but ideological, demonstrating that American power served purposes beyond domination. The B-25 recurred throughout the Pacific War, serving in every theater, dropping bombs on targets from Burma to the Philippines, from New Guinea to the Japanese home islands. It became one of the most produced American bombers, with nearly 10,000 manufactured by war's end. But its legacy was defined not by its production numbers or its combat record, but by that single mission on April 18, 1942, when 16 of them launched from a carrier deck and flew into history. The raid proved that American power recognized no borders, acknowledged no safe zones, and could manifest anywhere in the world given sufficient will and ingenuity. It was not the bombers themselves that terrified the Axis powers, but what the bombers represented: a nation with global reach, unlimited resources, and the organizational capacity to coordinate complex operations that required different military branches to subsume rivalry in pursuit of strategic objectives. In the post-war interrogations at Nuremberg, German military leaders were asked what moment during the war first convinced them that defeat was inevitable. Many cited Stalingrad or the Normandy invasion, but General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the German Armed Forces High Command, cited the Doolittle Raid. "When I learned that American bombers had struck Tokyo from carriers," he testified, "I understood that we were fighting an enemy unconstrained by geography or conventional limitations. If they could reach Tokyo 4 months after Pearl Harbor, they could eventually reach Berlin. And once the Americans decided to reach Berlin, No amount of German fortification or determination would prevent them. The raid was militarily insignificant. Strategically, it announced the inevitable outcome of the war. Keitel's assessment captured the essential truth that the raid demonstrated: that modern warfare had become a contest not of territorial control, but of reach, mobility, and the ability to strike targets previously considered invulnerable. James Doolittle received the Medal of Honor for leading the raid, was promoted 2 grades to brigadier general, and went on to command air forces in North Africa and Europe. But his most significant contribution was not his personal courage or his subsequent commands. It was the proof of concept he provided on April 18, 1942, that American military power could not be confined by oceans or continents, that no enemy capital could consider itself safe, and that the nation which controlled air power and sea power simultaneously would dominate the global battlefield. The B-25, that workhorse twin-engine bomber never designed for carrier operations, had accomplished what no diplomatic warning or strategic threat could achieve. It had placed every Axis city on notice that distance was no longer protection, that American bombers would appear overhead when least expected, and that the war would be fought on terms America chose, not terms geography imposed. On that gray April morning, as Doolittle's Mitchell clawed into the sky from a pitching carrier deck, it carried more than bombs and fuel. It carried a message written in aluminum and aviation gasoline, delivered across 650 miles of ocean and 1,200 miles of hostile airspace, dropped on a capital that had never imagined itself vulnerable. The message was simple and absolute. American power has no borders. It does not stop at coastlines or respect mountain ranges. It does not ask permission or accept limitations. It manifests where needed, when needed, because the nation that projects it possesses resources beyond calculation, ingenuity beyond prediction, and a willingness to risk everything to prove that freedom can reach anywhere tyranny exists. The B-25 that launched from Hornet that morning was not just an aircraft. It was a statement. And the statement echoed across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, into the bunkers where Axis leaders plotted and planned, and slowly came to understand that they were fighting not just an enemy, but an idea. That democratic power, when fully mobilized, recognized no limits save those it imposed upon itself. The raid that military analysts dismissed as a stunt had rewritten the rules of global warfare, and the bombers that flew into certain danger proved that the greatest weapon America possessed was not any particular aircraft or ship or bomb, but the audacity to believe that impossible missions were merely difficult ones not yet attempted.